Hi guys, Doug Marcaida here with Tomas from Tactical Tavern, and welcome to Sharp Talk. Thank you very much for joining us on our first Sharp Talk. And the reason for these Sharp Talks is it's everything that keeps our minds sharp with information and education.
Specifically, we're going to be talking about the forward grip. And make sure to stay along for this series because we're going to cover all the grips as well as a variety of other martial arts tricks and tactics. Doug, can you give us some more insights on the specific way that we would grip a knife?
Okay, so there are a lot of grips that are out there. It's a forward grip, a reverse grip, all these things. Well, get a grip on it. We're going to keep it simple. Today, we're going to start off with the forward grip, the overhand grip, the hammer grip, slap grip in Filipino martial arts. And what is it basically all about? It's any kind of grip that you have over the top of your hand. Now, there are different versions of this, but the way I talk about grips, when I think about it, I just look at the angles. When I look at the blade, you have one held this way, blade in or blade out. You have one held this way, blade in or blade out. And you have one that goes this way or this way. So the way I'm looking at it is the different ways that we're gripping. If we're underhand, overhand, this way, if I'm going forward for thrusting, and if I'm reverse gripping it for whatever reason. And the reasons for this is that each one has a purpose. Each one is designed depending on the handle, the guard, or the way it's going to be used. So different grips have different uses. So let's talk about the forward grip, the hammer grip. What's the word of a hammer grip? So if we think of that, it's basically anything that's above the hand held this way. Now, what makes it different? What are the variations? A lot of variations definitely are based on your thumb and index finger, how they work together in placement of the blade. So we're talking about this. Is there a guard? Is there something to stop the thrust or the chop? The use of an overhand grip, which I'll just go with overhand, it's over my hand, is really the thing that forms an angle. If you see that, it forms this right angle here. It's basically used for slicing. When using that, slicing or chopping with this downward motion to keep your whatever at bay or distancing, right? When we're talking about, in combat fighting is to keep something far away. You get that distance. So the use of an overhand grip really talks about also the length of a weapon, keeping your opponent away from you, like in nature. Stay away, and using this natural motions, whether it's horizontal or upward, at a chopping, slicing, or hacking motion. Now, the question is, do we put our thumb on top? Do we put the thumb on the spine? Where does it go? Well, a lot of that depends on the function of the weapon, the length of the weapon, and the grips. So talking about the overhand grip and the finger placement of the thumb or the fingers, if your blade is long, basically, where the weight starts to shift and it's on the blade, there are certain ways that you're going to be determining how you're going to be putting your hands. If the blade is shorter, where the weight is closer or by the hand, you start to have finger placements that help this. Let me explain. This is a shorter blade. The handle is heavier than the blade. So if I'm doing cuts, pressure cuts, the thumb will ride and place above this area right here because I can pressure cut with this blade, especially when we're talking about small folders. Definitely a small blade, much lighter. If I want to add on the slicing with the cuts, the thumb placement allows to give you that particular feel for a power slash. A lot of blades have jimping above the spine, jimping on the spine, so you put the thumb perfectly in there, and you can feel the retention and control. The thing about grips is that the purpose of a grip is so that you can control the blade. It's about controlling the blade. So different grips allow you to control the blade differently. If I want a pressure cut because the blade is smaller, the thumb stays there. Now, if I have a bigger blade, do I put my thumb there? No, because what happens now is the weight is forward, just like you would in a hammer. Point of percussion is right here. That all that fulcrum now can be on my thumb joint. And what happens here is that if I have the thumb, just like in training with impact weapons, if I hit that, I can snap and break my thumb. If the weapon's much smaller, then the thumb works there because there's no weight in front of that. That's an important consideration on where you put your thumb placement. Now, in other blades, when you have a heavier blade, the thumb placement simply falls on the side where you're holding on to that. All four grips, and just like a hammer, that's what you're hammering in. You don't use a hammer with your thumb placement when you're hitting on that. Once again, this one all is based on why you're using these particular grips.
If the blade's smaller, thumb pressure on top to give more stability. And if it's larger, you wrap it in and lock it in tight to provide that stability so it doesn't tweak back your wrist.
Correct. Now, the question is, we're going to remember, we're talking about the forward grip alone. We're not even talking about the other grips. One of the things about thumb placement also is because sometimes you don't have a guard. Now, this blade has a guard on a forward grip. It's harder to put your thumb placement above or anything about the guard because now what others would do is they would put the thumb placement behind the guard or on the side. Now, why would you put it behind the guard? This now is starting to lean toward when you're thrusting. The key about these small placements is that we can also think of forward grips as also using one for retention, blades that have a flare. It's got a flare. I can use my pinky to prevent it from going forward as a grip. This does not have a guard. Using the thumb does lock it into place for slashing. It does not protect it for the possibility of thrusting. But thrusting with this particular blade or this particular grip is based on an angle, upward thrust. So we're thrusting on an upward angle. Let me use this as an example because it forms an angle here, right? We're talking about overhand, hammer grip, and all this, right? So if I thrust and start to do that, I'm already bending my wrist. That's a different grip. We're going to stick with this. Now, can you thrust with this pointing up? Yes, it's more of upward thrusting when you see this at an angle where you don't break the wrist. And those are the kinds of thrusting that you will have when you're using this particular grip. You have your slashes and you have your thrusts. So the idea is for every thrust on its return is a slash. For every slash on its return is a thrust. For every thrust on its return is a slash. For every thrust on its return is a slash. Now, the question is for a lot of grips also on the hammer grip or overhand grip is, do I keep my blade in, out, or do I keep my blade in? That's basically the preference of the practitioner and what they're doing. Obviously, blade out is easy because I'm attacking something that's far away from me, right? But there are blade techniques where they actually have the blade in on an inward piece. When you have your blade for upward fighting, you start to see that your grip also is going to change. Now, all of a sudden, because I am fighting gravity, the strength of fighting that is now on the index finger. As opposed to earlier, the strength is on the thumb placement, right? So when you're thinking about blade up, you're thinking about being able to fight something coming into or upward, and the index finger helps with that. The thumb is the assistance of holding on to that so that you have a good grip when you're doing upward fighting, especially with Bowie knife fighting where they have that idea of blade up. If it's blade up, the index will lead the thumb. If it's blade down for smaller blades, you can see that the thumb will lead the index finger, meaning it's in front of the index finger, whether it's in front for cutting down or behind for smaller blades in knife fighting.
Now, I heard that it was also possibly to deflect incoming blades and then go into like the back cut, the famous back cut. Is that a technique that you can utilize with big and small blades?
All depends. Once again, when we're talking about small blades for parrying, it's probably something that you're not going to find a lot, right? It's the limb that you're going to move into the forearm to move in there. For longer blades, you have the idea of parrying with that, or parrying or moving the blade side to side. It's all different preference. The idea of blade on blade hitting is really something that you would never do with your own blade. That would definitely ruin your blade, right, in combat. It's the limbs that we're trying to attack to reach out for that, not blade on blade. The side of the blade helps to parry because it's wider as you're doing this, depending on what thought process or what systems of blade training you've been doing. But the idea also of this blade cutting up is because if you align it, especially with the bowie, the blade tip leads forward. Whereas if you think this way, the tip isn't as forward canted. So you start to see how which edge gets in there. But a lot of us are really using gravity fed strikes, meaning easier to come down and cut than it is to cut up. I'm fighting gravity right here. It requires more work for me to keep cutting upward than it is to just drop the weight in your slices and chopping.
The back grip, how you're utilizing different finger muscles going down or coming back up, and how that changes your hand position. That's really cool. That's an insight that I don't think a lot of people consider when they pick up a tool.
Right here, what I have is a modified kukri. This is Jason Knight's kukri. Now, if you look at the kukri, it's a downward chopper with a weight being forward, and it usually has a bow tie style handle right here. This particular is modified because he put a more like, this is a very common Filipino knife where you have the flare. The reason for this is when you're gripping on this, you don't want to, stone fist it. Because then when I'm stone fisting, you're so tight on that, even the work is you're doing the work with the weapon as opposed to let the weapon do its work. One of the ideas there is to keep your other fingers loose. So with this particular work I'm doing here, I can simply just use these 3 fingers to chop. So if I'm doing this, I can immediately do some chopping work here, just like that. And I'm not even moving, it's just my wrist, the flick, very relaxed. And I'm doing lots of cut as I'm doing that, as opposed to stone fisting, cut everything. Now, this is a lot of work. So the use of these 3 fingers as I'm cutting is one of the ways to make a working man's chopper right there do the work for you. Let the handle and the finger placement do all the work as you're cutting with them. You can see that. Now, when we're talking about chef knives, right? It's no longer, when you start to see where they're doing the work, nobody works with a blade down here and chops this way. You start to see where they start to use it where it's canted forward. That's why I kind of separate the idea of this grip and this modified forward grip to doing that, because sometimes you'll have the finger placement in front, sometimes you'll have the thumb placement in front, depending on the length of the blade, and sometimes you'll just have to have it held this way, depending on if there's a guard or not. Because now this is really more about the thrusting in combat or short work where I'm chopping on the board and doing all these little chef knife work that I'm doing. So where's my thumb? Is it on top here? And at the end, once again, it's all based on personal preference. Am I going to be chopping it this way? Do I need more cuts with that? Or do I just let the blade do its work? It's really a preference thing, but it's very also important to know how it feels on the hand. The more you work with it, your fingers will just adjust because you're going to get hot spots. We talk about this all the time on the show. You're getting hot spots in there. That's where you're getting blisters because you're holding it, stone fisting it. All these different things are going to come into play with the way you're cutting.
Is that a new chef's knife?
Well, this one here, this is my version of a Siberian cleaver called the Grande Fratello, the big brother of, well, it was based on the knife design that I have here with the dart. So that's the big brother of this baby right here.
That's awesome.
But it's really designed for, kitchen work. It's really based off of my version of a Siberian cleaver. So one of the ways to actually tell you which way to hold the blade is by taking something that is not a blade. And we're talking about a regular stick. Our backgrounds here, obviously, we're both Filipino martial artists. We do edge and impact. But how does the impact teach on the proper way of holding an edge? The handle is a connection of the end user to the blade. Same thing, the handle of the stick is a connection of me to the tip over here. So when you're thinking about this in terms of hammering, when you're starting to hammer with that, the point of percussion is up here, the point of impact is up here. You start putting your thumb in there, you're going to start to feel it's uncomfortable, especially when you're doing stick locks and everything. You start to feel the pressure onto your thumb. So that's going to make an issue right there. Also, when you're training with this, as you're hitting, like you mentioned, we use the knuckles to index. When I say, if I can close my eyes, I index where my knuckles are because that falls in line with my edge when I'm cutting and working with the blade. That's one of the important things. Also, when you're cutting at an angle here, if you don't break your wrist, you're much stronger in your cuts because if you start tweaking your wrist, it starts to affect the way you're cutting with the blade also. So these are the things to keep in contact, or let's say when you follow through with a strong wrist or let the blade, but when they start to get blade heavy, That's when you start to see the difference about balance, why balance is so important, because you should be controlling the blade, not the blade controlling you in the way it's being used. So now there's also a question when we're talking about overhand grips. So it's also based on anything that's above, forming an angle, with knives that are going to start to get bigger and bigger after using those. But there are also curved blades like the karambit that can now is being used to have an overhand grip also, even though it's curved. The common conception is that with karambit as a fighting weapon, it's held underhand. But now, because when we really look at the karambit, what it's based for, the karambit as a weapon is underhand because it mimics when you're fighting a regular motion. But when I start to do this, it mimics what you would use more so in farm tools. And what does a karambit look like? A small version of a sickle. So you still have the ideas of raking with this. An overhand grip of a karambit, because being smaller of a blade, should also have the ability to post your thumb right there for deeper cuts and different designs. This is my particular design here for the tribal K. You have that, right? So deeper cuts with that, because I control the blade. But at the same time, when you're doing this, you also have the ability to push away if I'm thrusting with it without having to change my motion. I can cut this way, or I can thrust and lead with the tip. So raking, slashing, hooking with the blade here, or thrusting as I'm thrusting with the blade held in the same configuration. You can have it down here, but when you start to feel the pressure of the blade for anything that is hooked, it's going to capture, it's going to move. So with that comes the idea of, once again, using the thumb as a stop and the thumb as added pressure into whatever you're raking and cutting, because it's a small blade. You wouldn't obviously want to use this thumb right here with heavy blades where your thumb is trying to cut through with that, because now the pressure is on that one joint.
Doug, what are your thoughts on using the karambit ring when you're in the forward grip? Is that something that's useful or not good?
Another question about karambits is, well, then if on this particular grip, the underhand grip, you use the index finger for its use, should this also be held with the pinky finger held inside the karambit? My preference, no. The pinky finger is so much smaller compared to the index finger, and its use is also going to be different. The pinky finger is usually the idea of just using it for retention at any point. Here, I just wrap around it as I'm cutting and using it and jabbing, right? But should I require to be able to use my hands, which is the beauty of having rings, is that I can only simply slide it in there, and now I can pick up other stuff. I can do other stuff with it because it's simply there for retention purposes. But if I'm in the mid-use of the blade, I take my finger out so that it doesn't get caught and snap my finger when that's happening. So once again, when people ask me, what is the advantage of having the overhand over the underhand? Distance. I can reach further. Now, this is overhand this way. This is underhand this way. It doesn't really make much of a difference until we go to the modified forward grip where we start bending and breaking the wrist. Now, see the distance I'm able to get with that? Here, not so much distance. Here, not so much distance. Here, the minute we go to the next grip, as we start to modify it, where the wrist is broken, I can get distance with my blade. And that's the next grip that we're going to go, which is I call the modified forward grip. And the reason for that is more about linear thrusting. There are so many names that people come with this particular grip, but the main idea here is that you have to understand that there is a difference when you start using this particular grip, because it breaks that wrist. It's still overhand in a way, but then all the different considerations will comes into play with what kind of blade you have. Does it have a guard? Does it not have a guard? Am I thrusting with it? What's my stop when I don't have those guards?
Doug, what is one training tip that someone can utilize to perfect and practice that forward grip?
Well, we're talking about different kind of grips. You definitely want to find yourself working with a trainer that has a false edge on it. This way, whatever you're hitting, you can feel the impact. You see, it's one thing to do it all in the air until you hit something. That hitting will either let you feel the impact or let you ride the edge so you know how to move the energy past something that you're not cutting through, or learn how to be able to retain the blade. So when you're doing that, you have to train with cutting and chopping with stuff before going on to the real thing. You have to do both because a lot of times people just train in the air until they go to chop something and they go, oh, the blade started flying. Did I stone fist it? Am I holding it? So the question is, how tight should you hold it? All depends on what you're cutting. At the same time, it should be like holding a bird. Not too tight where you kill it, not too loose where it flies away. It keeps you relaxed. But in training, you should do all the different things. I see, okay, I'm going to stone fist this and start doing that. Okay, good. This is how it feels. I'm going to use it loosely with just my fingers. I'm going to try it with the thumb here or the finger placement here and all these different grips that you're going to be doing simply to know how do I react to it? How am I going to be able to use it? It's a question and answer of not right or wrong, but what works for me at the time of its use.
Doug, thank you so much. And where can people find more information?
Well, we definitely have this. We're on our social media. You can find me on Instagram under Doug Marcaida, Facebook and Doug Marcaida, TikTok and Doug Marcaida, and my YouTube channel, Doug Marcaida.
Wonderful. And if you're interested in learning more, make sure to check out the Tactical Tavern and Original Corona Screama in Vallejo and San Francisco. With that being said, make sure to drop a like, share this with a friend who would be interested, and subscribe to see more.
And thank you for joining us for our first episode of Sharp Talk, and stay sharp.